All right, let's dive into one of the wildest family dramas in the book of Genesis, the story of Jacob and his uncle Laban. It is an absolutely captivating tale of love, rivalry, and some serious deception. But it also reveals some deep truths about human nature and faith. So to really get this, you've got to ask yourself a key question. What happens when a world-class con artist finally meets his match? Because the answer to that question is really at the heart of this entire story. You see, Jacob's early life was all about tricking his own family. First his brother Esau, then his own father Isaac. But his journey is about to lead him straight to someone who plays the game of deception even better than he does. This is the story of how Jacob, the ultimate trickster, gets a taste of his own medicine.
So our story kicks off with Jacob literally on the run. He's just swindled his older brother Esau out of his inheritance and blessing. And, to put it mildly, Esau is not happy. So Jacob flees for his life, basically trading one massive family problem for what's about to become a whole new one.
And you know, this entire 20-year saga is framed so perfectly by two dramatic escapes. It starts with Jacob running from his brother, and it's going to end 2 decades later with him running from his uncle. Right from the get-go, this tells you that this whole journey to find family, well, it's not going to be the safe haven he was probably hoping for. So Jacob makes it to his ancestral homeland, and almost immediately, he falls head over heels for his beautiful cousin, Rachel. He goes to her father, his uncle Laban, and strikes what he thinks is a pretty simple deal to marry her. But this is where the tables completely turn on him. Jacob doesn't have any money for a typical dowry, so he offers to work instead. And the Bible says these 7 years seem to him like only a few days because of his love for her. I mean, the guy is completely smitten and totally willing to put in the time. Okay, so the 7 years are up. Jacob throws this huge wedding feast. But then Laban, in just an unbelievable move, pulls a bait and switch. Under the cover of darkness, he sends his older, less loved daughter, Leah, into the wedding tent. Jacob only figures out he's been tricked the next morning, and Laban's excuse, oh, it's local custom. His price to finally get Rachel? You guessed it, another 7 years of work. It is such a stunning moment of irony. Jacob, the guy who conned his own family, has been totally and completely out-conned. So the next chapter of the story is just defined by nonstop conflict. You've got this bitter, painful rivalry between the two sister wives, and at the same time, an economic war is heating up between Jacob and his father-in-law, Laban. The dynamic in Jacob's house becomes incredibly toxic. Rachel has all of Jacob's love, but she can't have children. Leah, on the other hand, is unloved, but she's very fertile, which in that culture gave her a ton of status. This just sparks this desperate, ugly competition for love and legacy, and it gets so bad that both sisters bring their maids into it to have even more sons for Jacob. After working 14 years just for his wives, Jacob stays on for another 6, and during that time, Laban's deception just keeps on coming. Jacob claims that Laban changed his wages 10 different times. Now, in the Bible, the number 10 often signifies completeness. So Jacob is basically saying, he cheated me thoroughly in every single way you can imagine. But here's the crazy part. Despite all of Laban's scheming to keep him down, Jacob becomes incredibly wealthy. Laban keeps trying to rig the system, but divine intervention just keeps blessing Jacob's flocks. And even when Jacob tries his own hand at some, let's call it folk magic with striped sticks, the text is really clear. It's God, not the sticks, that's making him prosper. It's a huge theme here. Right in the middle of all this human scheming, there's a bigger plan at work, turning exploitation into blessing. Okay, so after 20 long years, things have gotten really, really tense. Laban and his sons are now openly hostile and super jealous of Jacob's success. It's right at this moment that God tells Jacob directly, time to go, head back to your native land. But Jacob knows he can't just pack up and say goodbye. So Jacob goes to his wives, Leah and Rachel, and lays out his escape plan. And you know what? They are 100% on board. They feel completely betrayed by their own father, saying he sold them off and then spent all the money, basically stealing their inheritance. They're ready to go. And then, in a massive twist, while they're packing to leave in secret, Rachel steals her father's household gods. Now, these were not just little religious trinkets. In that time, possessing these idols could be seen as a legal claim to the family inheritance. So this was her final, defiant act against the father she felt had cheated her. Well, Laban finds out they've left, and that his gods are missing, and he is furious. He chases Jacob's group for 7 days and finally corners them in the mountains of Gilead. This sets the stage for a huge confrontation, a final showdown between these two master manipulators.
But before Laban can unleash all his anger on Jacob, God steps in again. He appears to Laban in a dream the night before they meet and gives him this very direct, very chilling warning. So Laban shows up with all the power to crush Jacob, but his hands are tied by a divine command.
The first thing out of Laban's mouth is the accusation, "Why did you steal my gods?" And Jacob, who has absolutely no idea that Rachel took them, just explodes with righteous anger. He fiercely denies it and then just unloads 20 years of frustration on Laban, detailing all the faithful service and constant mistreatment he put up with.
And the final act of deception in this whole saga, it belongs to Rachel. When Laban comes to search her tent, she cleverly hides the idols in her camel's saddle and just sits on them. She tells her father she can't get up because she's having her period, a culturally sensitive excuse that he can't really question, and just like that, his search is over. In the end, Rito gets the last laugh.
So with that standoff over, the two men finally realize their toxic relationship just has to end. They make a formal peace treaty. They set up stone markers as a boundary, swear an oath to God that they won't harm each other, and they seal the deal with a meal. It's a formal final end to 2 decades of fighting. So after 20 years of all this deception, this rivalry, this total dysfunction, you kind of have to ask, what is the point of this story? I mean, why is such a messy, complicated human drama given so much real estate in the biblical narrative? Well, the answer is all about the bigger picture. The main takeaway here is actually pretty profound. This story is not about giving us perfect heroes to look up to. Not even close. The whole point is to show that a divine plan doesn't rely on people being perfect. In fact, as one scholar put it, if it did, the whole plan would have failed right from the start. And that really brings us to the core idea. If you look at all the cheating and jealousy in isolation, it's just an ugly, disappointing story. But when you place it inside the larger narrative of God's purpose, it all starts to mean something different. The story suggests that this whole mess is actually being used to shape Jacob's character and to keep a much grander promise on track. And that leaves us with a final, thought-provoking question to chew on. Can a story filled with so much human failure and dysfunction actually serve a divine purpose? This story seems to suggest that not only can it, but that sometimes that's exactly how the biggest plans unfold.